It's incumbent on Israel to make sure that they can do that.
At least 29 people have died and several are badly hurt following a fire at a nightclub in Turkey. Several people have been detained for questioning. In Finland, a 12-year-old has been arrested on suspicion of murder following a high school shooting. One child was killed and 2 others were injured. And the government's commissioned independent research into headlight glare. There are concerns some are so bright that drivers are being dazzled. The move follows a petition with more than 10,000 signatures urging ministers to act. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 17 points at 79.35. The pound buys $1.25 and €1.16.
LBC Weather.
With Ripple Energy. Climate action you can be proud of.
Rain continuing to spread northwards from the southwest tonight. Light rain still lingering in parts of the north and a low of freezing. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening to you. It is 8 on LBC. Welcome to No, it's not Monday, is it? It's Tuesday's Cross Question. Bank holidays always completely confuse me. On the panel with us tonight, we have Matt Wrack, the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union, Angela Knight, former Conservative MP and Treasury Minister, and also former Chief Executive of Energy UK, Jonn Elledge is a freelance journalist, a columnist for the New Statesman and CapEx, and Grant Tucker, journalist and political commentator. They're here to answer your calls. The number to call 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 and you can WhatsApp us on the same phone number. And there's plenty of other ways to get in touch as well. You can even tweet us and email us if you really want to. And we'd love you to watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to our first caller. It's Paul in Twickenham. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Iain. Iain, 2 scenarios. I understand from reporting today that this aid convoy that was obliterated had told the Israeli authorities who they were, where they were going, what vehicles they were in, and they were blown to smithereens. And it reminded me of the time when Mariupol, the city in the Ukraine area that was decimated by the Russians, there was a theatre there holding 600 people, women, children, mainly women and children, and they went and painted outside on the road in huge letters the word children, and that building was obliterated and bombed. And my question is, does the panel agree that what went on today in Gaza under Netanyahu's management can be compared with what went on in Mariupol, in that theatre, under Putin? And
Okay.
Does the panel think, can the panel conceive that in this day and age it is possible that that there are people who will deliberately target the vulnerable and aid organisations?
Right. Okay, Jonn Elledge. We've got your point there, Paul.
Oh, I was so hoping you weren't going to go to me first.
Yeah, so was the other
I mean, it's an absolutely horrendous turn of events, isn't it? It's absolutely appalling that this happened. It's the UN in its statement today said that these kind of results were sort of an inevitable result of the way this war was being conducted. It does feel slightly contradictory that you have a military operation effectively to destroy large chunks of an area's infrastructure while simultaneously trying to get food and medicines into civilians at the other end. I just find the whole thing horrifying. I wish I had solutions. But
what about the comparison that Paul was making there?
I mean, I'm absolutely flapping here because I've not followed the Ukraine war that closely, so I don't recall this.
You haven't followed the Ukraine war closely? You've written a book about world borders.
The Ukraine does come up, you will believe, but it's not. I'm not a foreign policy expert. I'm absolutely not going to lie about that. Okay. It's just not my area.
I'm not sure any of us are in the studio tonight. Angela, let's come to you.
Well, what I think needs to happen now is a proper inquiry, into what's happened today. I don't know if an inquiry ever did take place with Mariupol. I'm not sure they allowed it. But if this has been an error, and who's to know, what it's got to be is absolutely properly investigated by, let's say, the UN. I'm not sure the UN's got quite enough teeth, but it's about the only independent thing we've got available. And to me, the primary thing is this. Those are poor young people, went out there to give a hand to the best that they could. And they're now dead. And I think the first thing that we should say is how appalling that is. I think, sympathies go to all the parents, whatever nationality they were. It's always young people that get caught up in this. I remember my aunt saying to me, wars are made by old men and fought by young. To a certain extent, that's the same now. So do I compare the two? I have absolutely not enough information to do so. But I do think that it is entirely correct that civilians and aid and war don't go together. I don't know what's happened here, whether it's an accident, whether it was designed, whether not proper information was given, whether proper information was not adhered to. I don't know. So let's have an independent group come in. In fact, I would prefer to see an independent group come in full stop and just stop that fighting, get out the hostages, because we're looking at something which in my mind is pretty horrific. It started in a terrible situation. It's not got any better. So a pause, a reflect, and have third parties. That's what the UN's for, after all.
Matt Wrack.
I think if the caller was referring to what appears to be double standards in the treatment of the two conflicts, then yes, I agree with that. I think you can find on the internet numerous examples of British or US politicians condemning acts of the Russians in Ukraine as war crimes. You'll find far more hesitation in anything that is happening in Gaza. The Israelis have very high levels of intelligence to the degree that they can send text messages to people to evacuate their building before it is blown up. It's staggering that they don't know that, therefore, aid convoys are passing through.
Well, they did know, that's the point.
Well, they did know. So, yeah, they need to be held to account. I suppose the final thought from me is it is horrific and appalling that people who've gone to aid a civilian population in such circumstances have been killed in this way. But I think we also need to remember that every single day there are dozens and dozens of Palestinian civilians being killed now, more than 32,000, probably several thousand more than that, not yet identified, a big chunk of whom are children. And the whole thing has been a horrific unfolding of horror for the past 5 months.
Grant Tucker.
I certainly don't think I agree with what the caller just said. I don't think it would be deliberately targeting these aid convoys. I think it's an awful tragedy. But that's the way that Israel is kind of using this war to get to its own ends. But I think the thing that we have to remember is, even though this was in a precision zone, it is still a war zone. And it is absolute travesty what has happened in terms of these aid workers, these 3 young Brits as well. I think they should be treated as heroes when they come back, because they've died in the most awful circumstances. I'm somebody who is pro-Israel, and I have to say that Netanyahu is squandering the goodwill of the West. And if this carries on and more aid workers die, we're going to see a lot more ill kind of feeling from people in the West. People like me who are pro-Israel, who think that Hamas should be defeated, but we can't have these innocent children, innocent aid workers dying on a daily basis.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it's one I made to the Israeli ambassador last time I interviewed her, and I said to her, you don't have to make it difficult for people who generally support your cause. But this isn't the first time, and I can remember in the few days after October the 7th saying on this programme, Israel must not do what it's done in the past and squander the support of world opinion. That's exactly what they've gone and done, isn't it?
And how are you going to convince Brits that Israel has the right to carry on taking down Hamas when we are about to bury 3 of our own?
But it's absolutely right,
taking down Hamas, is it? This is destroying an entire region, the entire infrastructure, homes, schools, hospitals being utterly destroyed. I don't see how that's got anything to do with destroying Hamas.
The IDF would say that they have killed, I think, is it 8,000 Hamas fighters they're saying? So to that extent, they have achieved part of their aim.
Interesting to see how they verify that.
But also, how many have they created? by the level of anger and resentment that's going to flow from this.
That I think is a very valid point, because, I mean, Israel had the huge support of the US, and even the US has now said, well, look, this has gone too far. And so the point about squandering what goodwill there was, unfortunately, that has happened.
Well, you look at the comments of David Cameron over the past few weeks. And, I mean, we've always been considered one of Israel's staunchest allies.
Absolutely.
We're not talking like a staunch ally at the moment.
And we're not. And you know, Hamas has as one of its remits to destroy Israel. So, you know, you can quite see how these tensions sort of build up and things.
Let's broaden this out a bit. Sally in
situation.
Edgware has sent in this text question. Why are police officers seemingly unable to understand why waving a swastika around central London is so offensive and wrong? Now, for those of you that have been in a cave over the weekend, a viral video clip from Saturday's pro-Palestine march in central London has shown an American woman called Jocelyn Weiss, who lives in London, telling a Met police officer that she's seen a banner being waved which features a swastika. The police officer tells her some context might be needed around the use of that swastika. What context could possibly be needed, Grant?
Well, there is no context. The Met Police should do their job and should be removing swastikas from the streets of London and arresting those who wave them. I think that's a very easy question to answer.
Angela?
Absolutely agree with that. Sometimes the police, though, do get caught between one group and another, and we expect them to somehow manage to get the judgments right. The policeman who said context didn't get his judgment right then. I am one of those, though, who is also concerned about the degree of sort of semi-threatening demonstrations that seem to take place. I don't know, I come into London on business mostly, but I've been caught the wrong side of one of those demonstrations, and I found it pretty hostile. And so there's something about the whole demonstration issue which to me isn't in the right place. And that's not me saying you shouldn't have demonstrations. Of course you should be allowed to demonstrate. And I also think that whoever trained that police officer to say, the context for the swastika, they got it wrong as well. So it's easy to say, what on earth was that chap doing? And I still say that. But the reality is I think the situation is a bit broader. I think that they get caught between the woke and the non-woke sometimes. Whatever they do is wrong. And perhaps we shouldn't go down the woke rabbit hole here this evening. But, let's
make an exception on this programme.
Let's not go there. But, yeah, he got it wrong.
Mind you, might get questioned J.K. Rowling later, you never know. Matt Wrack.
Well, I was someone who, as a teenager, went around scraping swastika stickers off lampposts and things and confronting people who were giving Sieg Heil salutes. So that's my record on this. I don't know. It does depend on the context, actually, because
I think it was a swastika on a banner. So we're not talking about multi-swastikas. We're talking about one.
I presume I'm guessing, and I don't know, that it's some sort of argument there's some sort of equivalence here, which again it seems to be in very bad taste to say.
But it's not just bad taste; it's anti-Semitic, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
It may be anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
No, it is, because we all know
that
the Nazis wanted to eradicate the Jews. Hamas wants to effectively eradicate the Jews as well as the state of Israel.
I think the conflict in Gaza is a bit more complex than that. What's being eradicated currently are the civilian population of Gaza. They are the people who are being obliterated.
But this whole war
and destroyed.
started on October the 7th because Hamas murdered 1,200 Israeli citizens, and therefore
we had this debate, Ian, in October, just after the attack, and you asked me whether it was appropriate, or the caller asked whether it was appropriate to withhold food, water and power. I was unequivocal then. You were equivocal. You said that it seemed to be justified on Israel's part. I've been consistent since then. I don't believe punishing civilian populations is appropriate in war. My position remains the same. And I think my position is the one that's been vindicated by the past 5 months.
I'm trying to remember if I did actually say that.
You did say that.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. John?
What struck me about this story is the incredible level of ignorance being shown by multiple people within it. I mean, how silly do you have to be to think that drawing a swastika on a banner is a good idea? Even if we're sort of charitable and assume that these are not, in fact, openly Nazi sympathisers, they are very, very stupid people indeed, aren't they? And I think there was a similar lack of, at the very least, emotional intelligence on show from the police officer, who was basically standing there going, well, it's not my job if you take it up with the police down there. I do wonder, the extent to which this is, as Angela suggested, poor training or whether it's, I just got the vibe that he just wanted the poor woman with the issue to just go away and leave him alone. And he didn't think how this would play.
Because he was there having to deal with it, and he thought, go away.
Yeah, and
it's the wrong decision.
I do sometimes feel for the police. They have had a difficult, like their budget has been cut the same as everybody else's. It's not a fun job, but nonetheless, it's a public-facing role. You need to treat the general public with a degree of respect that just wasn't on show.
Ian, I have to take issue with Angela's point about the demonstrations. I've been on many of those demonstrations, and I've spoken at 2 of them, of the Palestine demonstrations. That is not the experience I've had on those demonstrations. They are many families attending, young people, a very diverse group of people attending from all over London and from all over the country, and they are not intimidating demonstrations. I think the attempt to demonise people who go out and argue against a war, that's intimidation, and we have a trend towards authoritarianism in this country and across many other countries, which seeks to demonise people who stand up and speak out on issues such as this war. And we should defend the right to free speech and the right to protest. And I think those, when we look back, the people who demonstrated against the war in Gaza will be vindicated by history.
So to be clear, I wasn't against demonstrations. I've made it very clear that I think demonstrations are fair. But I did say that some of the demonstrations can be intimidating. You might not find them, but I have to say I have found them a bit.
And Jewish young people have found them very, very intimidating, walking through the streets, being shouted at when they've got kippas on. Anti-Semitism is on the rise in the capital.
There are many Jewish people attending those demonstrations.
I'm sure there are. But there are also many Jewish people feeling intimidated by them.
No, and that is absolutely appalling, and there has clearly been an increase in anti-Semitism since October the 7th, and that needs to be challenged and condemned, and there's also been an increase in Islamophobia since the period. So we've got, unfortunately, a horrific unfolding of events in Gaza, and it's leading to an escalation of divisions here.
But you can go to a pro-Palestinian march and rally without using slogans which people find very offensive, like "from the river to the sea," but also without you putting swastikas on posters.
Exactly.
But most people do.
Yes.
Most people do. There is a structural problem that if you have a demonstration of any size, there are going to be a significant minority of bad actors who want to cause trouble like this.
And the longer the demonstrations go on, the more of those bad actors tend to take part in them. But I think Matt is absolutely right. The overwhelming majority of people who do go on these marches are not like that. But there are too many people that are, and they need to be called out. We're going to move on in a moment to a subject which I think you'll all find a little bit more comfortable than the last 20 minutes have been. It's 8:20.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:21. Jonn Elledge has a book out. It's not actually out quite yet. It's out at the end of April. It's called A History of the World in 47 Borders. And someone said I should just read out the praise on the back cover, and I looked. There is no praise on the back cover because it's a proof copy. Now, the subtitle of this is The Stories Behind the Lines on Our Map. And there is a story, isn't there, behind every country's borders. So it's a brilliant idea for a book.
There is. I've had to massively pick and choose my stories and then compress huge amounts of historical and geographical
Volume 2 coming already.
Oh, that's the plan. Everyone listening just needs to buy about 10 copies for their friends and family. But you can find a story behind any line on any map. But it's just a different angle at looking at the history of the world from ancient Egypt to the borders of space. There you go. Wow. That's the spiel.
I mean, how do you garner enough knowledge on all of those sort of very different subjects?
I read a huge amount and hope I haven't got anything massively wrong. I got some historian friends to read it for me to look for howlers.
You're a big nerd, aren't you?
I am a massive nerd. I mean, basically, I'm a professional nerd. So
you're the nerd's nerd, aren't you?
Well,
Grant?
I look forward to reading that book. I have my father's stamp album from when he was a little boy. My father was born in 1918, so when he was a little boy, it was in the 1920s. And that stamp album actually gives a lot of information, just, like that book. So, for example, there's no Poland in there. The borders of Austria are completely different, and you get it from these stamps. It's absolutely fascinating.
I used to collect stamps, and I'd learned all about geography and capital cities and all these sorts of things and royal families from my stamp collection.
Exactly.
I still have. Yeah. Right, I think it's about time we went to another question. It's from Jamie in York, who says, does the panel think the Tories will really get as few as 98 seats in the upcoming general election? Angela, you have rather painful memories of the last time the Tories lost to a landslide, don't you?
I had this awful feeling you were going to ask me first on this question. Yes. I was 92 to 97. So of course 97 was a landslide, and I was part of the rubble.
You were slid out.
That got kicked out. Yes, that's right. And we saw it coming. Actually, we saw it coming. But I don't think that today looks quite the same as 97. I mean, first of all, I think the biggest winner could be, we don't like any of you. The population has got itself pretty fed up with politics in lots of different ways. And I think there can be all sorts of differences right across the country. I mean, I come from the north of England, and the north of England doesn't really do things like the Lib Dem. It goes one side or the other. And you get these big, switches across the political divide. In the soft south, it's rather different. Who's to know what's going to happen in Wales and Scotland? So I think we're looking at quite a muddle. And you're absolutely right. Could the Conservatives go right down to a handful of seats? They could, after all that happened in Canada. And what's happened in Canada, of course, they've all bounced back now. But at the same time, you could have one of those sort of strange outcomes where everybody gets something. It's decided by a few hundred votes in not a lot of constituencies, and you end up with somebody trying to do some deals in lots of different ways. But I rather agree with the comment of Sir John Curtis, who's that great sort of professor of working out what people think. And he said fairly recently that 99% Conservatives are not going to form government. I think we would probably all agree with that. I know I'm supposed to maybe not agree with that, but let's be realistic. But he was also very unclear as to what the combination would look like of, presumably, if the Labour Party was the majority party. His impression, so I understood it, was that they would be having to look to some form of coalition. So I think it's very uncertain. Not comfortable, though.
Well, this poll that came out over the weekend from MRP, they polled 15,000 people, quite a lot. They've suggested that the Conservatives might only win 98 seats, with Labour winning 468. That's more than Tony Blair got. It also suggested the SNP would win 41 seats, the Liberal Democrats 22 and Plaid Cymru 2. The poll suggests the Green Party would lose the one seat it currently holds in Brighton. Well, there are so many things wrong with that.
Well, there are.
It was commissioned by Best for Britain.
I mean, if I could just add one more thing. In 1992, I was not supposed to win the seat, and all the polls said I didn't. And there was one of these sort of exit polls done, and it was just on one polling station only. And I actually won it with about 5,500. So the polls are telling you something. They're giving you a very good snapshot, particularly of discontent.
Well, they're showing a consistent Labour lead of 20,
and they're saying a consistent Labour lead.
Matt Wrack.
Will they reduce to 98 seats? We can only hope.
Would it be good for the country, though?
No, I think, look, I think it will be justice for many people. I think there is huge anger at what's going on. I'll come on to the disillusion politics point. But we've seen this unprecedented cost of living crisis. You've got young people who've got no hope of getting a home, getting on the so-called housing ladder, living in horrific conditions in the private rented sector. Public services have been destroyed. So this is chickens coming home to roost in terms of this opinion poll. So it is possible. I think it's an opinion poll. It's not the actual vote, and things can change before an election, of course. And presumably Sunak is hoping that the economy gets better and all that. I think just a point on Labour, however. I think, and I'm a member of the Labour Party, but what Keir Starmer can't rely on, in my opinion, is simply not being Rishi Sunak. I think people want some hope, and if Labour win, particularly such a resounding victory as those polls indicate, people will have high expectations, and the question is, what does Labour do at that point, and can they then win a second election? So there's lots of challenges for the Labour Party in that as well.
Grant.
Well, if Tory MPs are anything to go by, the ones I've been speaking to all think they're going to lose their seats. So I think that gives kind of a snapshot into what's going to happen at the next general election. But it is just feels so pessimistic. And your point about we do need a bit of hope. Whatever happens at the next general election, whether Tories have a complete and utter landslide defeat, we do need that hope. And I just feel like there's none of that at the moment. It almost feels like this government is a dog that's been hit by a car and it's limping on. And really we should take it to the vets. And I think it's time for a general election. It's the only question that people are asking now.
Anyone in particular you'd like to put down?
I'm not going to say. But yeah, I just feel everything feels so stale right now. We constantly keep talking about the next general election. We're talking about things that don't really matter. What matters is the cost of living. What happens is the economy. And nothing is going forward. No legislation is going through Parliament. We're in a complete state of kind of chaos.
John?
I mean, rather boringly, I agree with everything that's already been said. I do slightly object to Grant's choice of metaphor, but that's because I have a dog. But it's like, it does feel unlikely that the Tories would be reduced to 98 seats. That would be their worst ever result. I think the worst was 1906, I think, where they got 155, something like that. They've never been below 100. But the polls do keep coming, showing them, like, this is not an outlier. There have been quite a few of these polls showing results that would make 1997 look like a good result for the Tories. I think nobody really expects this to happen because it does just feel like, well, of course it can't. It can't. The Tories are the natural party of government. But we have a lot of data suggesting it might, and it's not clear to me where the recovery comes from. Like, they need about a 12-point increase in their vote share to get back to 1997 levels. Where is that going to come from? With so much anger in the country, just demographically, which bits of the electorate are going to, at the last minute, think, oh, actually, I'll vote Tory? It's really unclear to me that those votes exist.
And the Tory voters I've spoken to recently, most of them are either switching to Labour, as you said, Angela, or actually said they're not going to vote at all. So I imagine what we're going to have is a really low turnout, and actually a lot of Conservative voters will just stay at home.
I think there's another group of voters, former Conservatives, who are going to vote for Reform. And to me, Reform hold the key to this. If they continue on the trajectory that they're at the moment, they could be the key to Keir Starmer's majority, because they would enable Labour to win so many Tory seats that otherwise they might not do.
So is that 1983 again, where Labour was split by the SDP and the Conservatives got a massive landslide, and that's what's going to happen with Labour?
That's a myth. I think it's more like Canada 1993.
Which is, how many seats did they get?
3, and none of them were the Prime Ministers.
Don't exaggerate.
It was 2?
2.
Oh, I apologise. But Kim Campbell, the Prime Minister, lost her seat.
I was going to say prize for anyone who can name the Conservative leader, but you already won it.
Right, I did say I was a nerd.
Jamie, hope you are happy with the answers to your question. Thank you very much for submitting it. And if you'd like to ask a question for our panel, the number to call 0345 6060 973, or you can text 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. It's 8:31. Daryl Jackson has the LBC News headlines.
Israel's Prime Minister has told Rishi Sunak he's appalled by the killing of 3 British aid workers in Gaza. They were targeted along with 4 others in an airstrike as they delivered food to displaced Palestinians. A 12-year-old boy is under arrest after a school shooting in southern Finland. 1 pupil of the same age was killed, while 2 others were seriously injured. And a signal failure at London's Euston Station has caused chaos. It's left passengers travelling on the West Coast Main Line stranded on trains. LBC weather: rain continuing to spread northwards from the southwest tonight. Light rain still lingering in parts of the north, and a low of freezing.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It is 8:33 on LBC. With us on the panel, Angela Knight, former Conservative MP and Treasury Minister, Jonn Elledge, freelance journalist. He's a columnist for the New Statesman and CapEx, and his new book, which I'm going to brandish now. I don't think I brandished it in front of the camera, did I?
Excellent brandishing,
It is called A History of the World in 47 Borders, the stories behind the lines on our maps. I've just had a flick through it, and I'm already gripped, so I will be buying a copy when it comes out. Buying it as opposed to getting a freebie. But I am taking this one. Grant Tucker is here, journalist and political commentator, and Matt Wrack, General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union. Val in Burnley wants to know this. What's wrong with doing more to protect trans people from hate speech? Police Scotland say comments on social media by J.K. Rowling in which she describes several transgender women as men do not breach Scotland's new law against hate speech, which has made stirring up hatred in relation to disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity or being intersex a crime. There are also laws against stirring up hatred in relation to race, colour, nationality or ethnicity, which have applied across Great Britain since 1986. Interestingly, the new Scottish law doesn't mention hatred against women or misogyny at all. Make of that what you will. So, the question, what's wrong with doing more to protect trans people from hate speech? Grant?
I think there's nothing wrong. I think the ludicrous claims that this is the death of free speech in Scotland, I don't think it is. We had the 1986 Public Orders Act, which covered Scotland, and that covered race, religion and sexual orientation. And now we've added transgender identity to that. I think that's absolutely fair. I don't think I, as a gay man, can look a trans woman or man in Scotland in the eye and say, I should be covered by my protected characteristic, but you shouldn't. And I think that we should be doing more to protect trans people. They're one of the most vulnerable communities in the country. They're constantly getting whipped up hatred online, in the media, and they don't deserve it. They want to get on with their lives and they deserve respect.
John?
I mean, I agree with everything Grant just said, really. I think, J.K. Rowling today seems to have been sort of prodding the new law to see where the line is. And as I understand it, the Scottish police have said, no, that wasn't a breach of the new law. It feels to me right that there is a high bar before you call something hate speech. I think that's fair. But you can also just be incredibly rude and unpleasant for no reason at all without it being hate speech. And there's also a lot of that out there.
That's true, but that should never be against the law, should it?
It shouldn't be against the law. But I think it's also, people should still be able to call it out and say, that's just not a nice thing to do. Mm. I think a lot of people in this debate have been radicalised into just being unpleasant to other human beings for no particularly good reason because of where they hang out on the internet. And I just find that quite upsetting, to be honest.
Angela?
I almost am unable to comment on this. I agree with what is being said, but in some respects, it strikes me that I don't quite see why this law was necessary in Scotland. And I don't quite see either how we expect the police to police it. And I don't quite see where the limit is, which is unpleasant, if you like, freedom of speech, and where it goes over the top and into hate. And what J.K. Rowling seems to have done, whether we like it or not, is she's put out some statements which test the law. And it strikes me that the vagueness of this particular law means that it's going to put a huge amount of pressure which you don't want on the police. You want the police to go and not have pressure to do that. There's burglaries, there's murders, there's all sorts of other things, and they're spread thinly. And laws need to be clear, and you can't be clogging up the courts with unclear laws. So I totally agree with the point that you make, that there needs to be sort of decency and fairness for everybody. Frankly, I'm surprised that some are covered in this and others can't. I don't see, why women can't have their own protected space somehow. That doesn't seem to be covered in it. So I'm back at the beginning. I'm at loss as to why it's needed. I'm at a loss to understand why it hasn't got its proper barriers in place. I'm at loss to understand how it's going to be enforced. I'm at loss to see, how we're going to park it on the police. And J.K. Rowling's tested it, and I suspect others are going to have to test it now.
She sort of tested it, but the only place to test it really is in court, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So we're going to. It's going to be very interesting to see the first. Well, of course, there will be court cases on this. Matt.
Yeah, I think we should absolutely be standing up for the rights of trans people who are marginalised, attacked, discriminated against, and so on. I think there is a question, the degree to which you can change people's views through legislation. I think that is a difficult balance to get. We've had some of these debates in our organisation, in the fire service. We have trans members in the fire service and in our union, and we've had to have some of the discussions around women's spaces and so on. And interestingly, we put out a circular on this issue probably 4-5 years ago, calling for a balanced and rational debate on the issue.
Did you have one, Matt?
No. Actually, internally it has been, but I think that leads me to my final point. I think it is so unbalanced by the way people behave on social media, which I think is just encourages people to behave in a way that they would not generally dream of behaving in a face-to-face discussion. Anonymous accounts, people, keyboard warriors and so on, we've all come across them. People say the most appalling things, which and I sometimes say, OK, I'll come and see you, and you meet people face-to-face and they're completely different to their online persona. I think
that's the thing, most people don't know a trans person.
Yeah.
Most people haven't met a trans person. They're a tiny, tiny proportion of the population. And if you had a trans friend, you would then realise that they're just like the rest of us.
Yeah. And that's why I think actually the key two words you said is a balanced discussion. And this is a particular obvious one where a balanced discussion is needed. But frankly, balanced discussion's needed in all sorts of areas, because the one thing we don't seem to have these days are balanced discussions.
No, because,
we have all sort of stuff that
have
sits out on social media, whereas you're rightly saying, Matt, people just say what the hell they like without having thought about it. And we rely on those who have a public platform to actually give us that balance to some of the debates, and we don't seem to get that either.
But this is a complicated matter of competing rights that has been sucked into a culture war dynamic, which makes it incredibly difficult to have a grown-up conversation about it. And I think it's the worst thing possible that could have happened for this debate.
And politicizing it, of course, seems to.
Well, which the Prime Minister seems to delight.
Yes, I agree. Look, I'm not defending anybody on this, apart from the fact that if you are ever going to work your way through complicated matters, you can only do that by having an open and honest and sensible
You've had
discussion.
to do that. I mean, I think people think of the Fire Brigade as sort of predominantly a macho kind of environment. Maybe that's an old-fashioned way of looking at it. But, I mean, how have you approached this subject, and how have you got your members to sort of sign up to any kind of code of conduct that you might have wanted to have?
We still have problems in the fire service on some of those issues, and there have been some quite worrying reports in the past few months on sexual harassment, for example. But as a union, we try to have a calm, rational debate. We have a women's section within our union. We have an LGBT section within our union. We try to encourage them to
Grant wants to join that.
to speak out. And so we've had long-standing, women in the fire service have had to fight for their spaces in the fire service, changing rooms, in what was previously an 100% male workforce at one point, of where do you get changed as a woman? When trans people then identify new challenges that we have to discuss, I think the only way you can do it is by listening to people's different views, concerns, including allowing people to speak out if they've got concerns. And that normally, I think you find that you can answer those concerns. So actually what we argue for is dignity for everyone in the workplace, including how you get changed, showered and so on, which is one of the issues we've had to deal with in the fire service.
But we can't have a balanced discussion with the likes of J.K. Rowling when she's discussing with a trans person and immediately misgenders them. She's calling people like India Willoughby and Menno Bergdorf trans women on Twitter, he, him. That is derogatory, that is demeaning, that is disgusting, and it is bullying behaviour, and it should be called out for that.
Well, it may be, but it's not against the law.
It shouldn't be against the law, I don't think, either. But we can still call out vile behaviour, and we should.
You can, but do you not find that this is symptomatic of other debates as well, where you have people... I hesitate to use the word extreme, but on the extremes of the argument on either side, where you've maybe got J.K. Rowling over here and India Willoughby over here, and never the twain shall meet, and they both seem to regard each other as evil personified and won't brook any discussion.
And I think you could broker the discussion, Ian.
Well, I'm not sure I could with those two, but...
social media is a bit of an echo chamber, and actually when you speak to many ordinary people, they're far more balanced on these issues than the people who shout the loudest on X or whatever.
Well, I would agree with that entirely. And, what I do now is I am on the board of a number of companies, and you would expect companies probably to ignore all this. They don't. They have their women's groups, they have their LGBT groups, they have, as you just said, Matt, a respect for different people who want different spaces, who want different changing rooms or whatever. But it's done quietly. It's done with a sort of sensible discussion. It assumes that different people want different things. And where, to my mind, the whole issue here goes wrong is that you somehow, as you rightly say, and you've got the extreme views take place and they overwhelm the entirety of the discussion. And I ask again, was this law required? And if it was, where is all the necessary, boundaries that leave it to at least make it clear what its meaning? Because if we're just going to end up with it all in the hands of the police, all in the hands of the court, and that's not going to get anybody anywhere.
Well, I look forward to interviewing Hamza Yousaf about this at the Edinburgh Fringe this year. Tickets on sale today, by the way. Just thought I'd plug that. Right, we have lots more questions to come. It's 8:45.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:46. I think it's fair to say that Peter isn't a fan. He says, your conversation just causes depression, resentment, and is completely unnecessary. Your mental state is besmirching others and brings people down. I'll put him down as a doubtful, I think. Don't you? Right, our panel with me is Matt Wrack from the Fire Brigades Union, Angela Knight, former Conservative MP, Jonn Elledge, freelance journalist and author, and Grant Tucker, journalist and political commentator. And they are delighted to hear from Stephen in East Grinstead. Stephen, what's your question, please?
Good evening. I'm delighted to hear from you as well, Iain.
Excellent.
When Thames Water shareholders refuse to pour money down the drain and the customers are drowning in higher bills and sewage bills, is Thames Water a busted flush?
Boom, boom.
Great puns, great puns.
Matt Wrack.
Absolutely. I think the whole, a huge scandal around the whole privatised water industry. I think people are outraged at it, and a complete failure to invest in infrastructure over a lengthy period of time, prioritisation of profits and shareholder interests over those of users. And my view is that the industry should be brought back into public ownership.
On what terms?
As tighter terms against shareholders as can be delivered.
I mean, would you want to basically nationalise it without compensation?
Well, if we could do, yes, but I suspect we would run into difficulties on that. But I don't see why people should be allowed to profit from an industry which the public built up over many generations and take huge profits out of that industry over years and then expect the taxpayer to bail out exactly the same people at the end of that process. I think that seems wrong, and I think many people suffering with water bills and insufficient supply and insecure supply would share that view.
Now, Thames Water have brought in an insolvency company to help it restructure and attempt to avoid bankruptcy administration and being nationalised. Now, its parent company has £18 billion of debt and may struggle to make a loan repayment, which is due later this month. Now, Angela, you were in Parliament when the water industry was privatised, I believe, or was that just before you...
No, it was before I was in there, yeah. It was the energy industry, the big generating companies which were privatised.
But it was a controversial privatisation
yes, it was.
at the time.
Yes, it was.
And from my reading of it, it was the main reason for privatisation was because the government decided that it needed huge investment because it was Victorian infrastructure, and the only way that could be brought about was through the private sector. And for the first decade, that was fine. But then it all seemed to go wrong when you had foreign companies coming in, buying up things like Thames Water. An Australian company bought Thames Water, basically raided it. And we are in the situation that we're now in. I mean, do you have any sympathy with Matt's argument about renationalisation?
I don't have particular sympathy with renationalisation, but I do have huge sympathy with the fact that it has gone wrong. And Thames Water, I mean, not every water company has got itself into a financial state. Thames Water is right up there as one that has shown everything that is bad as opposed to everything that it could have done and didn't. And if we go back to the point when it was privatised, as you know, the debt was wiped away. So the water industry was privatised with no debt. And the reason it was privatised was because there was a constant competition as to whether, use taxpayers' money to invest in pipes and sewage and all the rest of it, or whether you used it for education or hospitals. And there is always that tension. The way that it went wrong was, to my mind, poor regulation, because one of the reasons that we regulate utilities and you put a regulator around them is to keep that company, which is providing us with something which is essential, to keep that company doing whatever it needs to do in the right sort of way. And water is regulated for both its OPEX, its operating expenditure, and its CAPEX. And to have allowed it was Macquarie who really loaded up the debt in Thames Water. Yes, they say they spent some on infrastructure, and they did. But the reality is that they really stripped that company dry. And I totally agree they shouldn't have done it in the first place. But I also say that the company itself shouldn't have allowed that, and the regulator should not have allowed it as well. So there's a lot of steps which have caused us to get into the problem that we are now. But you will have had, I'm sure, debates on this programme about what I would call pre-packs, which is where a company gets itself into real difficulty and it gets itself restructured, leaves a whole load of its debt behind, but can find a way to carry on. And there is some sort of private-public type pre-pack, which I think should take place here. So those who deserve to be left with a debt get left with the debt. But Thames Water itself, who's brought in some decent new executives, as you know, at the start of this year, are actually able to carry on doing what they need to do, which is a mixture of invest and, of course, invest and supply us effectively with water. But how they're going to make money at it, I don't know, because there is an out of balance between what they charge for water and their fixed operating costs, even if we park the debt.
Simon says here, Oh yeah, Iain Dale jumped straight to shareholders being compensated. Geez, hey Iain, screw the shareholders.
Yeah.
Angela, I mean, this is a common perception among people on the left. I mean, explain why shareholders are actually quite important to the running of businesses.
Because they bring the investment in to enable that business to run. And
but they don't have a God-given right to profit, do they?
No, they don't have a God-given right to profit. It's quite interesting to see who, and I'm not arguing for that either, but it's quite interesting to see that the biggest shareholders are a couple of pension funds, of which the second biggest is, in fact, our university pension funds. You know,
we'll hold the pension managers to account then.
Absolutely right. Well, they clearly made a very big mistake, because the so-called structure is one which they will have thought gave them a steady and reasonable dividend for their people, which is those who are going to be the pensioners. So it is easy to condemn shareholders, but the shareholders are you and me. Shareholders are listening to this programme. Shareholders are pension funds. Shareholders are investment funds. This is how you bring capital in and how we get benefits as ourselves. But it hasn't worked in this instance. But you cannot judge.
Energy.
You cannot judge every business by one that gets in problem, or even 10 that gets in problem.
But it feels like there's kind of an incoherence in the right-wing argument for some of these privatisations.
Yeah.
Where it's like, OK, well, the state shouldn't do this. The state isn't up to doing this job. We should get the private sector in to do it. But then it turns out the state also isn't up to the complicated regulatory framework they need to create.
Well, at
which point, surely natural monopolies should stay with the state, shouldn't they? And we should just rethink how we do capital investment.
There are different ways which I think, if we were discussing the water industry now, you know, should it be privatised or not, i.e. still nationalised, there would still be a load of people like me, for example, who would say nationalisation or nationalised industry is not going to give the best result. But clearly, you know, nationalised, privatised is the bookends, and there are different structures in between. And I come back again to what was the point of putting in a regulator, and the answer was to make sure capital was spent right, operating expenditure right, the individuals, all of us.
But if the regulator doesn't have
regulator
doesn't have teeth, it's doomed to fail, isn't it?
Well, I agree with you. I'm not saying that somehow everything is perfect.
No, but in this case, Ofwat hasn't had the teeth to do what it needs to.
Well,
Has anyone got an example of a regulator that does work?
I think Ofwat.
Obvioly, Ofcom are a superb regulator.
Sorry, energy, the banks,
Ofwat are able to regulate, I say again, both the OPEX and the CAPEX and the price. That is an awful lot of regulation. That's an awful lot of interference. Why didn't it get it right? And that has to be part of a proper inquiry on this. Absolutely has to be.
A certain amount of it's going to be industry lobbying, isn't it?
No, I'm sure it is. I'm sure there's a whole series of reasons, and lobbying will always take place. This programme, no doubt, lobbies from time to time, or dare I ever say that?
No. My lobbying days are long gone.
But irrespective, there has to be, you know, clarity of what has gone wrong here, and the errors and the mistakes have to be sorted out, and you cannot just leave it all back on either the taxpayer or the consumer.
Now, of course, this industry was privatised before you were born, Grant Tucker.
Well, I've got a fact on that. Talk about lack of investment in infrastructure. There's been no new reservoirs built in this country in my lifetime since 1991. And that is, I just find astonishing. We've just had the 18 months of wettest on record since, I think, 1847. And yet we're looking forward to hosepipe bans and droughts this summer because we don't have enough reservoirs in this country because the water companies haven't invested and built them.
Also because NIMBY's campaign against them.
Exactly.
And politicians aren't bold enough to say, no, we need this, go away.
It is actually... You're dead right. You're back into the whole planning process. It's impossible for a reservoir. And by the way, there's aquifers as well as reservoirs. And surely,
what's one of them when they're at home?
It's an aquifer.
Yeah.
It's the water that's sort of trapped in the rocks and down in sort of pools below the rocks and things. So it's not a reservoir. It's not a river. It's an aquifer. And there's
you have to be careful how you say that.
Yes, you don't want to have a drink before you have the drink afterwards. And there's photographers all across the southeast and lots of
I've
country.
learned something today,
There
I have
you
to
go.
say. Right, let's move on to our fun question. It's from Pam in Worcester. Countdown Susie Dent says she wants to be buried with all 20 volumes of the Oxford English Dictionary. Which one book would you like to take with you when the time comes? Grant.
47 Borders That Made the World by Jonn Elledge.
Oh, you're a drink.
But really?
The Lord of the Rings, probably. It's a book I loved as a kid.
John?
My serious answer of my favourite novel is probably Any Human Heart by William Boyce, but I'm tempted to say War and Peace because I might actually read it at that point.
Angela?
Well, do I understand the question correctly, that we're in our coffins?
Yes.
Okay. Well,
So you've got your teddy bear.
So there is a dictionary called something like the Uxbridge English Dictionary. Now, this is that one where it was done by that wonderful group,
I'm sorry, I haven't a clue.
Yes, bang on. And they take the words and they make something terribly, different and funny. So if I've got to lie in my coffin, looking at the eternity of not being around, I'll at least take something that's different and funny with me.
Matt?
Well, I know you said no and say it. I will be cremated. And as a confirmed atheist, I don't think I'm going to be reading any books. So, to me, slightly pointless exercise. I'll wind people. I'm going to take Marx's Capital with me.
Hey, I knew it would be. What about you, Ian?
None of you mentioned the Kama Sutra.
Well, it's not a lot of point when you're dead, Ian.
There's not a lot of point with any of this.
You're not going to be very flexible at this point, are you?
They'd be permanently stiff, though. Thank you very much indeed to our panel tonight. Matt Wrack, Angela Knight, Jonn Elledge and Grant Tucker, who's about to expire. Tomorrow's panel includes the broadcaster and author Gavin Esler, former Conservative MP and Minister Michael Brown, and the former Labour Party official Richard Power Said. And yes, you've correctly noticed there's only 3 there, so there's one more still to be booked. Who will it be? Tune in at 8 and find out tomorrow. Now, in the next hour, we are going to move on and talk about the subject of knife crime, because the courts are apparently being rather lenient on people who commit knife crime offences. In fact, 30% of people who've committed a second offence are not sent to prison. Should they be? And why are the courts so lenient on people who commit multiple knife crimes? I don't understand it, but maybe you can educate me as to why this is. 0345 6060 973. We talk about knife crime a lot on the programme and have done for the 14 or 15 years that I've been doing it, but nobody ever seems to be able to come up with the answer to knife crime. Let's have a go in the next hour, shall we?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Rishi Sunak has told Israel's Prime Minister he's appalled by the deaths of 3 British nationals in an airstrike. 4 other aid workers were also killed while trying to deliver food to displaced Palestinians in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu had this to say earlier.
There was a tragic incident of an unintended strike of our forces of innocent people in the Gaza Strip.